Musser in a second. Hey, Paul, could I get this one on for just a second? Thank you. And there's a little bit of background music, if you could turn that off. And if you can hear me, if you're out in the lobby, we're going to get started here again in just a second with Alex Musser. So Alex and I used to go to church together when his father, Dr. Mark Musser, was the pastor at Grace Redeemer Bible Church. And over the years, Alex has got the opportunity to serve in several of these conferences and teaching. He's been to Libya? Liberia. Any other foreign countries?
To teach or just been?
Both.
I think just Ukraine, Israel, I don't know. Yeah, different places.
That's right, with the mission, on the mission field with your parents.
Yeah.
In Ukraine, yeah. And it's just been great to watch Alex develop his gift as a teacher. To hear what he has to share today, and here's Alex Musser.
Yeah, thanks, Andy.
Thank
you. Is this on, by the way? I can't tell. Is it on, the mic? Okay, all right, I think we're on. Okay, cool, all right, so my name is Alex, and I guess I went to the church a long time ago. I know it's totally different now, but so I know some of you guys for my whole life. And I guess that's my intro. I don't know if that's the best intro, but that's what's going on. So we're in Daniel chapter 2, and we're going to finish up the prophecy and explaining it. But before that, I thought we would jump briefly to Isaiah 1. Because if you're anything like me, you like to ask a ton of why questions. For example, I ask way too many why questions, but I like to do this a lot. I'm always just asking why. So a question that popped in my head was, why would God allow an evil nation like Babylon to attack Israel, right? It seems kind of unfair, right? So I thought it might be good to kind of briefly talk about why. We sort of talked about it, but maybe just a passage that kind of helps, I guess, show me why. Oh, is the mic not on?
Yeah, you're muted.
Oh, I'm muted. So, what about? Yeah. Okay. I didn't. Okay. All right. Is we good now? I think. I don't want it. Okay. All right. So let's go to Isaiah chapter 1. And so the book of Isaiah was written before Judah, the southern kingdom, went into captivity in Babylon. And there's a lot of things that talk about the potential for them to be in captivity because of the things they were doing. So let's just kind of read a few verses. Let's just start in verse 16. And I'll read verse 17. I'll just read 16 through 17, okay? So this is God speaking to his people Israel during the time of Isaiah. And he says, "Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil of your deeds from my sight." And then he kind of lists some of the evil deeds. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice. Okay, so justice is one of the things that they weren't really doing. They weren't seeking it. Reprove the ruthless. So ruthless is kind of people who are being super mean, for lack of a better term, being kind of violent. Okay, so they were not stopping any of that. They were allowing people to be violent. Defend the orphan. Sounds like a lot of that wasn't going on. They weren't taking care of the people who were really suffering. And then plead for the widow. Okay, so if you kind of look at this list, these are the things that God wanted them to do as people, as his people, and yet they weren't really doing any of these things. And so because of them not doing any of these things, this is one of the reasons why they were brought into captivity. But it all starts with abandoning God. So I think kind of the idea of what's going on here is that when you abandon God and when you lose sight of who God is, you end up finding that God, so to speak, in other ways, and you end up kind of corrupting yourself, okay? And then you lose sight of what is right and wrong because you don't have that ultimate ideal. And so then you end up thinking that things that are good are actually things that are bad, or you start thinking that things that are bad are actually good. And so there's kind of this process where once you lose sight of God, you kind of start just going down and down and down and down. And that's kind of what happened to Israel, to the point where they were doing child sacrifice. They weren't caring about the orphans or the widows. They weren't seeking justice. They weren't stopping any sort of violence. It was just a whole, mess of just awful things going on. And because of that, God had to judge them, okay? So I think that kind of helps me at least understand some of the ways in which this captivity of Babylon happened. So because they forsook the Lord, and because they chose to engage in all this terrible behavior, therefore they were swept away into Babylon. So that kind of helps me at least kind of put myself in this situation and trying to understand exactly what is going on. And so that's just kind of a little bit of an intro for me as we go through this. But as we go through, right, we're going to kind of explain some of the prophecy, okay? So a lot of people have talked about this prophecy. Tato did a good job talking about it. Cody too. So everyone's kind of talked about this prophecy, but we're going to kind of go a little bit more in depth. But a lot of what's been said is kind of what I'll be repeating. So there's not necessarily going to be a lot of new information, but we're going to kind of go through some of this. All right, point one. All right, so God used Nebuchadnezzar's dream to give us an outline of the kingdom that will rule the earth during the times of the Gentiles, or the latter days. So we'll kind of talk about all these different kingdoms, which we've already been talking about, okay? So point A, Daniel 1 through 2. In 605 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar first defeated Judah, God began to allow Gentile nations, one after the other, to dominate Israel and build world empires. Okay, so once Israel fell, you kind of start seeing these world empires become more dominant. You see Babylon, you see Persia, you see all these dominoes kind of falling into place. All right, point B, Jeremiah 33:15. Because Israel habitually failed to follow God, they forfeited her rights to sovereignty as a nation. Israel will not regain complete sovereignty until the millennial kingdom when the Messiah rules, okay? So they've sort of had a nation before. They kind of have a nation now, but it's, you know, they don't really have a king reigning from the line of David, okay? So not everything is fully complete yet, okay? There's still some things that need to come into place. So they've been through a lot as a people. Point C, in fulfillment of the Davidic covenant, and just a brief discussion, like what is the Davidic covenant? It's kind of just confusing if you hear the word Davidic covenant, I don't know what that means. But like the idea behind it is that it's a promise that God made to David, basically saying that there's going to be a king from his house or from his line that's going to be on the throne forever. So that's kind of what we mean when we say Davidic covenant, okay? That ultimately there's going to be a king from the line of David who's going to sit on the throne and the world's going to be a better place, right? So that's kind of what's going on with that. But yeah, Jesus Christ will rule on earth forever as both King of the Jews and King of the world. Okay, so something really cool about the way that the way that the Bible kind of works is that when Jesus comes, yes, he's for Israel, but it's also supposed to be a light to all the nations. Okay, so you kind of he works through Israel, but the point of Israel is to then expand all the nations. Okay, so when God cares and loves Israel, it's also part of his purpose of using Israel to show himself to all the world. Okay, so there's this like fully inclusive, like this comprehensive view of God trying to save all of humanity, which is pretty cool because, we're not Jews. So it's cool that we're involved in that too. Okay, point 2. So the head of gold was Babylon. As the dream indicated, Babylon was the first empire prophesied to overshadow Israel. Okay, and it's the first one who took Israel into captivity, which we've talked about. So point A, the head of gold represented Babylon's unsurpassed riches and power, okay? And I'm going to read a quote pretty soon, but they had a lot of gold, okay? They're super rich. You guys ever seen, what is it, like The Hobbit, and there's like that dragon that has all the gold, and he's just hoarding all of the gold, That could be similar to like kind of thinking about Babylon, right? They destroyed everyone, and they're just kind of sitting on their riches, okay? And so they had a lot of gold. And one thing about gold, if you have a lot of money, you have a lot of gold, it can kind of make you arrogant, right? Because you think you have everything in the whole world, okay? So that's kind of what ends up happening to Nebuchadnezzar. But here's a kind of a little, super pixelated, terrible photo of what the Babylonian Empire looks like. But that's kind of the scope of their rule. So they pretty much dominated the Middle East during the time when they were in power. Okay, so point 1. Interestingly, gold was so plentiful in Babylon that sometimes walls were overlaid in gold. So yeah, a lot of money. Point 2, Babylonian kings were absolute monarchs. No one could counter their dictates. So yeah, not really the best way to set up government if you want people who care about other people. There's really no checks and balances. Here's a quote from a Greek historian. His name is Herodotus, and he wrote in around 400 BC. I think it's like 480 BC. So he wrote this a long time ago. And he was dubbed the father of history. He was kind of the first historian, so to speak. I mean, not really, but people really admired his history writing. And he kind of writes about this, okay? And I'll read it from here because I can't read it from the back. But he says, in this temple of Babylon is another chapel down below. So he's kind of describing what Babylon was like, right? And he says, in which is seen a great gold statue representing a seated Jove. I don't know what a Jove is. But close to the statue there is a great gold table. The throne and the dais are of the same metal. The whole, according to the Chaldeans, weighs 800 gold talents. Outside of the chapel is seen a gold altar on which only suckling lambs were sacrificed. There was, moreover, in those days within the sacred area a statue of massive gold whose height was 12 cubits. I have not seen it and only report what the Chaldeans tell me about it. So when Herodotus, who was sort of around the time of the Babylons, when he talks about Babylon, he mentions gold so much, okay? So you can kind of parallel this to how Daniel describes the statue, right? It's a statue of gold, okay? And it tracks with history. Okay, they had a ton of gold, right? They were super rich. They had all these gold statues. You know, we know from Daniel 3, what did Nebuchadnezzar do? He made a gold statue, you know. Like, who knows, right? There's all this gold. They can just do whatever they want with it. All right, so point B. So kind of what I'm trying to do is to say that, like, it's kind of fun to, like, pull sources from history and also compare it with the Bible and kind of see what you can piece together. I think it's helpful. I like doing those kinds of things. But point B, the Babylonian Empire lasted from 605 to 539 BC. Its golden, I like the pun there, qualities began diminishing soon after Nebuchadnezzar's death in 562 BC. So we'll kind of talk about that. All right, so here's another sort of historical thing that I found. So here is a stone inscription, and it's called the Verse Account of Nabonidus. Now, Nabonidus was the son or the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so he has this tablet that was written either by him or people around him. This one might have been written a little bit later, but it was written around the time of Babylon and around the time of Persia, okay? So it's cool when archaeologists can find this stuff, and it kind of gives us insight into the past. But notice what it says here. After he, Nabonidus, had obtained what he desired, a work of utter deceit, so I don't necessarily understand all of it, that's okay, there's only a few things I want to mention, had built this abomination, a work of unholiness. When the third year was about to begin, he entrusted the army to his oldest son, his firstborn, the troops in the country he ordered under his command. He let everything go, entrusted the kingship to him, and himself he started out for a long journey. The military forces of Akkad marching with him, he turned to Tema deep in the west. So here we have an inscription. You don't have to really understand much of it, but kind of what's going on here is that Nebuchadnezzar, okay, he has a son or a son-in-law named Nabonidus. Nabonidus comes to the throne. This tablet thinks he did it in an unfair way, right? He says, utter deceit, abomination. He sort of like takes over, apparently, in a bad way. But notice what he does. He installs his oldest son to be in charge of the kingdom, okay? And then if you go to Daniel 5, you see this guy named Belshazzar, okay? So Belshazzar is the person who Nabonidus installs as king. Well, what's interesting is that Nabonidus, he installs his son as king, but then he goes all the way to the west. So he kind of gets out of his kingdom, okay? And so what happens here is that, so this is after Nebuchadnezzar. This is right before the Persians invade. Nabonidus is being a terrible leader. He goes off for like 10 years to worship another god. He actually ends up forsaking the Babylonian god Marduk, or he doesn't really like him as much, and so everyone's kind of upset, and he installs his son as king. And so what's going on here is that the Babylonians are struggling, right? They don't really have their leader. He's gone, and so they're weakening, okay? So it kind of helps explain why Persia is able to take them over, okay? So this is just kind of some history, some cool things that I learned that kind of help tie in to what we're talking about. All right. Here we have, so that's kind of how Babylon ends up ending, which we'll talk about in a second. But here's kind of the 73 years, okay? So Nineveh's destroyed. This is the way that Babylon gets power. But notice there's Nebuchadnezzar. He brings in Daniel. There's all these prophets. And then there's Nabonidus, okay? So Nebuchadnezzar is in 600 BC. Nabonidus, his son, is in 556, and they get conquered in 540. So Nabonidus is kind of the person who ends up kind of sinking Babylon. And then this is when they fall in 539. So that's kind of just like a brief history of what's going on in Babylon. So, point 3. The second empire to dominate Israel was represented by the chest and arms of silver. This empire was constituted by the joint Medo or Persian empire. Okay? So, what we're doing in history, we see Babylon, we see Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is a great king. He ends up dying. His son, not so great, walks away, leaves the kingdom for a while, and then this new kingdom comes up and takes him over, okay, and that's called Persia. So now we'll talk about Persia. So here's the Persian Empire. As you can see, it's a little bit bigger than the Babylonian Empire. In fact, they actually end up going all the way to Greece a little bit, which ends up actually irritating the Greeks. So then it kind of makes sense why later on the people from Greece come down. So there's just kind of some interesting history to talk about. But the empire is bigger. It stretches into Egypt a little bit too. All right, so here's another thing I found. So I'm sorry if you're tired of history, but here's some more things that I found. So this is called the Nabonidus Chronicle, okay? So apparently there's a lot of inscriptions around this time of Babylonian history, but apparently this chronicle might have been produced by Persians describing Nabonidus, so this one might not be exactly from Nabonidus. But it says this, okay? This is discussing how the Persians end up forming with the Medes, okay? So it says this. So in the 6th year, Astyages mustered his army and marched against Cyrus, king of Ansan, for conquest, okay? So Cyrus is the king of the Persians, okay? And this Astyages guy, he is the king of the Medes, okay? And so, we talk about the Medes and the Persians, but how did they come together, okay? And this kind of helps us tell the story, right? But notice Cyrus, the Persian, is attacking Astyages, the Mede, okay? So they're in a battle, okay? The army rebelled against Astyages, and he was taken prisoner. They handed him over to Cyrus, okay? So Cyrus ends up beating Astyages in war, and then Cyrus marched to Ecbatana, the royal city, the silver, gold, goods, and property, which he carried off as booty from Ecbatana, that he took to Ansan, the goods and property of the army of blank. And that's kind of where it cuts off. But notice it describes Cyrus in Persia attacking the Medes, okay? So it kind of ties into Daniel, the history, right? So, a few things. Persians are a little bit nicer than Babylonians. So, for example, Cyrus, when he beat the Medes, rather than just killing all of them and destroying their king, which is typically what rulers do, if you beat someone, then you destroy all of them, or you put them as slaves. What Cyrus did is he didn't destroy his enemies after he defeated them, but incorporated them into his kingdom, okay? So the former king of the Medes, he actually put him on his royal court, okay? So he actually made the Medes become part of his government, okay? So Cyrus, he assimilated rather than destroying other people, okay? So that's kind of how you get the Persian and the Mede Empire, okay? Cyrus took them on, didn't disrespect them, but actually used them so they could be stronger together. So this may also explain why Daniel was allowed to live on after Babylon was captured, okay? So notice in 539 BC, Babylon gets captured by the Persians, but Daniel's not killed for some reason. And maybe it's because the Persians didn't really do that, right? They were nicer. They probably weren't nice, but they were nicer than the Babylonians, okay? So they would actually bring people in and allow them to be a part of the, the rulership, okay? So those are kind of the Persians, okay? And point A, the Medo-Persian Empire lasted from 539 BC to 331 BC. Although Cyrus the Great of Persia was the first ruler of this kingdom, Darius the Mede co-ruled over Babylon, the Chaldean region, right? Because Persians were nicer, and because Cyrus was a nicer king, he allowed the Medes to have some authority, okay? So then when you get to Daniel in Daniel 6, he's underneath kind of like the Mede sort of rulership, right? He's underneath Darius, okay? But ultimately, he's underneath Cyrus. So point B, Persia was greater than Babylon in military might and in the amount of territory conquered, but inferior in national cohesiveness. Right? They weren't, they allowed people to kind of worship their own religion. Okay, they were not super strict on making everyone kind of conform to the same standard like the Babylonians were. Okay, so they weren't as cohesive, right? They allowed a lot more things to slide than Babylon did. So point C, the Persian kings were not absolute monarchs. They were limited in power by the law of the Medes and Persians, which limited the authority of the monarch to change laws impulsively. All right, so there's a little more checks and balances than the Babylonians. So I would rather live in Persia than Babylon, just if I was alive during that time. But they probably weren't. They probably both weren't very good to live. But point D, interestingly, silver money was used in the Persian Empire as a medium of exchange. Okay, so in Daniel, you get the silver arms and the silver breastplate. Well, they used a lot of silver. Okay, in fact, there's a historian that talks about when they were looted. I don't remember how to have this quote in here, but when they were looted, they took so much silver. It took them 3 months to get all the silver out of the city. So Babylonians had tons of gold. Persians had tons of silver. So it kind of helps piece together why Persia equals silver and Babylon equals gold. All right, 200 years of Persian history. Persia conquered Babylon. The second temple was completed. So what's also nicer about the Persians is that they allowed Israel to go back, okay, to build the temple, okay? And so Cyrus in Persia was very generous to other people, okay? They weren't as awful as Babylon, okay? At least in that sense. So this is kind of what's going on in the history of Israel. I know it's a lot. I don't know if we need to really go over all of this, but there's just different Persian kings. The story of Esther takes place during the Persian reign. They try to build the temple. Also, something funny, if you look at Persian history, there's like 8 different Dariuses. So there's like Darius 1, Darius 2, Darius 3, Darius 4. They just use the same name. There's also like Xerxes 1, Xerxes 2, Xerxes 3, Xerxes 4. So like if you try to figure out who is who, it kind of gets complicated and difficult. But yeah, this is kind of how they're treating the Jews, okay? So the Jewish people are in Persia. Cyrus allows them to go back to the land, at least some of them, and they try to rebuild the temple. And then you get Nehemiah, he puts the walls up, and so there's a lot of history going on here. All right, but the Battle of Issus is where Persia ends up eventually losing their empire, okay, which we'll talk about. All right, so here is a mosaic. So Persia ended up losing their empire to someone named Alexander the Great. And this is the painting from the 2nd century. They found it on like the floor of like a Roman, like some kind of Roman temple. But you can see here that there's Darius III, okay? And he's got his charioteers, and he's fighting Alexander the Great, and he's losing, okay? So now we have Alexander the Great, we have the Greeks coming in, okay? So in this amazing, huge battle, the Greeks end up defeating the Persians and then taking over. And the Greeks were super good at war. They were always outnumbered, but they just like destroyed everyone. So they had really good tactics. But yeah, so now we're on the Greek Empire, okay? And so just think about this. Like all throughout all this history, Israel is kind of, just there. They're not the world power, but they're having to be affected by all these, like all this war going on, like all these awful things going on. So, point 4, the belly and the thighs of bronze represented the Greek Empire, which was the third empire to overshadow Israel. So point A, Greek rule impacted Israel directly from 334 BC to 146 BC, and indirectly through military harassment until 63 BC. Okay, so it's the Babylonians, the Persians, and now the Greeks are over Israel, right? But Israel does not have its own nation. It's struggling. It's kind of just getting pushed around by everyone. So point B, after Alexander the Great overthrew the Persian Empire, he went on to conquer the entire civilized world, traveling all the way to India. Alexander was successful in merging many culturally diverse nations, okay? So he was just super good at being a military leader, and he conquered all these people. A famous fun story, if you guys ever heard of the Siege of Tyre, but it's the way that Alexander the Great conquered the city of Tyre, and he basically like built his own bridge of like a mile like into the ocean to then go into the city. So it was just like really impressive stuff. So he was just really good at what he did. Point C, the Greek Empire was territorially larger than both the Babylonian and Persian empires, but weaker because of a somewhat more democratic government, okay? Right, because bronze is a little bit weaker than silver. So I'd rather have silver than bronze, and I'd rather have gold than silver. So, point D. After Alexander the Great's ultimately or untimely death in 323 BC, the Greek Empire divided into 4 autonomous regions that often warred against each other. Okay, so Alexander the Great, this great leader, ends up dying, and then what happens? Everyone fights for power, and then it just ends up being a total mess. So. You saw that same pattern with Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar dies. His son is not a very good leader. Everything goes into chaos. So it's kind of the history of the world, right? Like sometimes there's strong leaders and they end up dying, and then everything else goes into chaos. So that's kind of what ends up going on all throughout history. Point E, interestingly, the weapons in the Greek Empire were made primarily of bronze. So I guess they like bronze. So here's Alexander the Great's empire, which is a little bit bigger, right? He got a little bit deeper into Egypt, and he spread out more here. And there's more of Greece because he's from Greece. All right, so now we'll briefly go through 300 years of Greek Empire history. And we just went through a ton of history, so this is like a crash course. All right, that's King Philip is Alexander's father. Alexander the Great, inherits like a lot of troops. He ends up becoming the leader, right? He's the goat of Daniel 8. So if you want to learn more about Alexander the Great, Daniel 8 has a lot on him. He dies. And then it gets split up, and then everyone fights. The Seleucid Empire is the one that ends up kind of being like in charge of Israel. Interestingly, have you guys ever heard of the Septuagint? Has anyone heard of the Septuagint before? Yeah, it's the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So what happened was Israel was, kind of getting run over by the Greeks, and so they wanted to, have their Bible translated into Greek. And so this is kind of when the translation started, okay? And so we still have the Septuagint around today. We still have copies of it, and it was actually the Old Testament of the early Christian church. They used the Septuagint. So super important, and that's a pretty cool story. And then Antiochus the Great takes Judea from Egypt, so there's all this war going on. The Maccabean Revolt, have you guys heard of Hanukkah before? You guys probably have heard of Hanukkah. But the story behind Hanukkah is based upon the Maccabean Revolt. Basically, a bunch of people in Israel rebel against the Greeks, and there's a story of how the candles were lit for 7 days, and God was with them as they rebelled against the Greeks. So there's so many rabbit holes to dive into, which I'll try to avoid. And then Roman influence begins in Jerusalem. Okay, so Rome actually ends up conquering Jerusalem. It's the Roman Empire. His name is Pompey or Pompey. He ends up taking it over. So that kind of starts the period of the Romans. Okay, so now we're going to talk about kind of the Romans. Okay, so we've kind of gone through a lot of history, a lot of random facts, history that kind of ties it all together. But now we're going to talk about the fourth and the final human-led empire, represented by the legs of pure iron and the feet of iron mixed with clay, was the Roman Empire. Okay, and so I'll just say one thing about this. This is kind of where everything starts getting controversial. If you go on Google and you Google who this final empire is, you're going to get tons of different opinions. Okay, so it's kind of controversial. So there's a lot of different opinions on what this empire is. So I'll just kind of say that because there's a lot of different beliefs. Some people think that it's just a future kingdom. Some people think it's past Rome. Some people think it's Islam. There's all these different disagreements about it. And so I just say that to say that I'm not always totally certain as to what exactly it is. But the one thing that we're going to talk about is that it's probably the Roman Empire. Okay, so it's okay to disagree if you want to disagree. That's okay. There's tons of books on this, but we'll kind of talk about the way that what we think it is. So point A. So although Rome was founded in 753 BC and became a republic in 509 BC, it did not become a world empire until 27 BC. Okay, so Rome ends up coming after Greece. Okay, so it kind of makes sense that the iron legs is going to be Rome because it's the kingdom right after. So point B, the Roman Empire became divided into two empires, the Western Roman Empire, whose capital was Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, whose capital was Constantinople. Okay, so now we're just going through all this history. Okay, so the Roman Empire, it ends up getting divided. You have the East and the West and all this stuff going on. It actually ends up becoming Christian for a while with Constantine, and there's a whole lot of, tons of history to talk about. I think we just went through like 2,000 years of history, so very crash course. Point A, or point C. The Western Roman Empire lasted until 476 AD when it was conquered by the Goths. Okay, so eventually the Roman Empire collapses in 476 AD. Point D, the Eastern Roman Empire lasted until 1453 AD when the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople. It was renamed Istanbul. So right, eventually Rome kind of collapses and gets overtaken, but it takes a long time. Point E, the two legs of the statue fittingly represent the division of this empire. Okay. So point F, Roman domination of Israel began in 63 BC when Pompey, I don't know what his name is, conquered Israel, and it continued well after the empire was divided into East and West. Okay, so Rome kind of dominated Israel for a long time. They actually ended up burning down their city and destroying their temple later on in history. Point G, iron weapons made Romans' military might greater than the previous empires. Okay, so the iron legs, Roman uses iron for the military, right? You can kind of see the connection going on there. All right, so here are the iron legs, okay? So 60 years of Roman history. So Pompey took Judea, Okay, and then Herod founded the Herodian dynasty under Rome. Okay, so if you ever thought about how did Herod come into power, right? He's in the New Testament. He's in the time of Jesus. Well, he ends up getting his power from Rome. And then Herod the Great rose to power, 37. And then Caesar Augustus came to power over Rome. So these are just kind of the things that are going on right before the birth of Jesus. And Herod begins the rebuilding of the temple. And what's really cool is that a lot of the walls of the temple are still up today. So the thing that Herod built 2,000 years ago, some of it's still standing. Okay, so Herod was an amazing builder. Of course, the temple's not there anymore, but some of the walls are. And then you have Jesus being born, okay, around 4 BC. So that's kind of like the history that takes us all the way from Babylon up to Jesus, okay? So you can kind of see that Israel doesn't really have their own nation. For a while they did, but they weren't really that strong, and so they're pretty much always under some other power, okay? So it's not a good time to be an Israelite. It's hard to have hope in those kinds of situations. Point H. Although iron describes Roman rule, the mixture of iron and clay in the feet of the statue may represent a unity weakness in the final stages of Roman rule before Christ returns. This might be caused by its religious diversity and the multinational nature of its final state. Okay, so notice how there was the legs of iron, but then there's the feet that are iron mixed with clay. Okay, so there seems to be some sort of like division going on here. Like, why is that split up? Okay, so what we're going to say is that it's split up because there was the original Roman Empire, but then it ends up kind of sort of going away for a while, and then it ends up coming back in the future. So point 1. So the 10 toes of this statue probably refer to the 10 kings, nations or regions of the Roman Empire that will unite to rule during the coming final days of the empire. Okay, we'll talk more about this in Daniel 7, and Revelation goes more in depth. So, but essentially there's something coming in the future that sort of has this Roman influence on it, and people call it the revived Roman Empire, which we'll kind of talk as we go through this. Point 2. Since the official fall of the Roman Empire, its residues have mutated and are found in Eastern and Western European nations, as well as in many other democracies and republics around the world that use a Roman rule of law type of government. Okay, so yes, the Empire of Rome fell, but there's still these Roman tendencies that kind of occur. So there's still kind of a lot of like Roman stuff going on. So that's why we're going to say it hasn't fully vanished yet. So point I. Since the legs and the feet of the statue were described by Daniel as one unit, we should expect Roman influence and domination to continue influencing governments until Christ's return at the second advent. Roman rule was different than Greek rule in that it was divided 3 ways between the Caesar, the Senate, and the people. Okay? Which is similar, right, to the way American runs government. So there's kind of what the point of what these slides are kind of say is that there's a lot of Roman influence that occurs in the way that we run the world today. Okay, so it hasn't fully vanished. Point J. The final aspect of the Roman Empire will be a loose affiliation of 10 nations that will come to be controlled by an extremely charismatic world leader called the Antichrist. Okay, so once again, remember Daniel 2 talks about these 10 toes. And then later on in Daniel 7, it'll bring it up again. And then if you go to Revelation, it'll bring it up again. And so pretty much what we have to do to figure these things out, we have to kind of bring all of it together and then hopefully try to figure out what's going on. But it's mentioned in Daniel 2, but it's brief. Okay, so we don't have a lot of information yet in Daniel 2. So point K. You may disagree, which is totally fine. But the authors of this curriculum do not believe the Roman Empire completely vanished, but has rather morphed into many national governments, now called democracies. After the fall of both Rome and Constantinople, the ruling class dispersed into the Germanic and the Russian regions. Okay, so this is one way to look at this, that the Roman Empire never completely collapsed, but it's still influencing us today, and eventually in the future it's going to come back in a more sort of terrifying way with a more awful ruler than the Caesar was. So that's kind of the way that we're presenting it. Point 1. Roman rule of law can still be seen in many nations that were once part of the Roman Empire. Okay? So once again, there's just a lot of influence that goes on. Point 2. This east-west tension that existed during the Roman Empire can still be felt in Eurasia. These Eurasian governments compete for influence, especially in regard to the Middle East and in particular Israel. So there's still kind of that east-west tension. There's the Orthodox Church, which is mainly in the east, and then there's the Roman Catholic Church, which is mainly in the west. So there's still kind of this interesting beef going on, east versus west. Just like in America, right? Like, right now I live on the East Coast, but I'm from the West Coast, so I like the West Coast a lot more than the East Coast, but only it's because I was born there. So anyways, like there's just these interesting rivalries that kind of occur, just like they still occur in the world today. Point A, back when Russia began to dominate, her leader was labeled the Tsar, or the Russian word for Caesar. Okay, so once again, we're kind of just talking about things in history that could help us explain why there's Roman influence. Point B, more recently when Germany sought to dominate the world, her leader was called Kaiser, or the German word for Caesar. Okay, so there's kind of this influence. It is kind of interesting. A lot of people love studying Rome. I don't know, I don't really hear a lot of people study Persia, but they love studying Rome. So there's an interesting fascination with Rome. So I don't know exactly what that means, but it seems to be more interesting for people. Point 3. These Gentile nations will overshadow Israel's sovereignty to some degree or another until a rock cut without hands comes and destroys them all. Okay, so we've kind of talked about all these Gentile nations. We've gone through a whole lot of history, but now we kind of get to talk about something that is pretty fascinating, right? That there is a rock that is going to destroy all of them. And notice that it's cut without hands. Okay, so how do you make a statue, typically? Just a question. Yeah, you carve. I don't know what people said, but you carve it, right? And you use your. Yeah, I asked the question, but I don't know what people said. But yeah, you carve it and you kind of use your hands, right? Whatever. I don't know. You use some kind of tool, whatever. There's some sort of work going on with your hands. Okay, and so when you think of these empires of the statue, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, whatever, right? They are created by the hands of humans. Okay. So these aren't godly kingdoms, right? They don't come from heaven, but they come from the earth. They come from the dust, okay? So that's kind of one way that you can contrast them. But this rock, right, we don't really make rocks. Rocks are just kind of there, right? They're not with hands, okay? So you can kind of see that what Daniel's trying to say is that, hey, these other kingdoms were created by humans, and they're trying to make something really beautiful, but there's actually a rock that's going to be made without hands that's going to crush them all. And it's because that rock comes from heaven. So you can kind of see the earthly contrast with the heavenly contrast as you kind of look at some of these things. Point 4. This Roman iron influence will again coalesce and solidify as the times of the Gentiles draws to a conclusion. Does anyone know what the word coalesce means? Yeah, it just means come together. I didn't really know what that word meant, so I was just curious. I mean, I know now, but anyways, before I didn't. Point 6. All right. Let's talk about the stone cut without hands, okay? So now we're going to talk about the good kingdom that's coming. Because one thing you see throughout history, you've got all these bad kingdoms, and what happens with these kingdoms, and in Daniel 7 they're described as beasts, but they basically tear everyone apart, okay? Everyone's kind of there for themselves. Think of a wild lion, okay? What does a wild lion do if it's hungry? It's going to try to get food, okay? It doesn't have any sort of filter. You can't talk a lion out of eating you. You're not going to be able to reason with the lion, okay? So that's kind of what ends up happening to all these human places, right? They don't have the filter of God anymore. They've abandoned that. And so they run to all these other filters. And so then they're just acting purely on instinct. And then you end up destroying and hurting a lot of people. So that's kind of what human kingdoms end up doing. Just look in history, look in the world today. And really, that's a lot of the stuff that we do to each other too, okay? Just because we're Christians doesn't mean that we also don't act a lot like animals a lot of the time too. And so it's the human problem, okay? We are all a part of the problem of acting like animals, and we are all a part of the issue of, messed up kingdoms. But there's a better kingdom that's coming, and it's going to be without human intervention, but it's going to be from the hands of God himself, which is the kingdom of God. And so, which is really encouraging because we build a lot of things that are messed up. The world is full of a lot of messed up things, but that's not the end of the story, okay? So my failure, your failure, the world's failure, everyone's failure is not the end of the story, but there's actually going to be a kingdom that's going to be established that's going to be far greater than all the failures that we have put together. And so the cool thing about this is that suffering, pain, disease, whatever, that's not the end of the story, right? There's something far greater that's going to happen. Point A, at his second coming at the end of the tribulation, the Lord Jesus Christ will destroy all kingdoms of men This will be so thorough that no evil rule will remain. Okay, doesn't it talk about in Daniel 2? The wind kind of blows it away. Okay, so pretty much the rock hits and then all this other awful things gets destroyed, okay? Which is a good day, because I don't really like awful things. You don't like awful things. And so it's a good thing that's coming for the future. Point B, this cataclysmic, it's not how the word is pronounced, this cataclysmic act of God will destroy earthly human kingdoms forever. No element of the rule of sinful man will be absorbed, adapted, or blended into the millennial kingdom. So one thing that happens today with kingdoms, Babylon was destroyed, okay? But there's still that influence, right? Because it happened, okay? So the Persians took on some of Babylon, right? I think Cody mentioned this. Then the Greeks took on some of Persia. And then the Romans took on some of Greece, and so on and so forth, okay? So in some ways, there's almost like a genetic code to the kingdoms, right? Because they start, and then the influence kind of goes down and down and down. But when it comes to God's kingdom, he's going to kind of do a full reset, okay? Those bad kingdoms are not going to influence how he sets up his kingdom, okay? He's strong enough, he's smart enough to filter out all that other stuff and set up his own kingdom. And so that's an encouraging thing. Point C, the eternal kingdom established by the Lord Jesus Christ will be perfect in justice in the extreme contrast of all previous kingdoms ruled by sinful man. Okay, so a lot of us want justice, right? Like on the news, it talks a lot about social justice, right? Everyone wants justice, okay? And eventually it's coming, which is an encouraging thing. So point D, God's destruction of the kingdom of man will be sudden and dreadful. Point E, knowing that Christ will bring victory for righteousness and will govern with perfection in the millennial kingdom should give us great assurance in the present. So point M, thoughts from Daniel chapter 2. So we'll kind of close with some of these thoughts. All right, who really rules on the earth? So Daniel 2 convincingly answers that question that God rules. Which is sometimes really hard to believe when you see all the pain and the suffering. It's like, how could God possibly rule over this? And yet, the conclusion from Daniel is that he still rules and he's still working through all the awful things that happen. Point 2, how should we speak in a hostile situation? Daniel decided to boldly but respectfully speak the truth to this absolute monarch, Nebuchadnezzar. He did this because he feared and served an even more powerful monarch, the God of heaven. So yeah, this is pretty bold, right, to go before the king and explain to him his dream, okay? Like that, he had to be pretty nervous, okay? So, it's just cool to see the way that Daniel was able to do all this stuff and the way that God empowered him to do these things. Point 3, how should you walk in light of God's sovereignty? Should we walk as proud Arioch, who took credit for finding Daniel? Or as Daniel, who gave all credit and glory to God? Like Daniel, we should humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God. And I think Cody mentioned this, but we're all created, right? So, technically, we don't really do anything that hasn't been given to us. But it takes a lot for us to actually believe that. All right, so that, I think, is the end of my section. But yeah, there's just a lot of encouraging things in this, and maybe I'll just end with this. I think hope is really important, which we've talked about. But one way that you can have hope in this world is that you can have an idea of the future. And the idea of the future is that God wins, okay? And so as you're going through all the pain of it, you can look forward to a day when righteousness will dwell. And so I think that's encouraging, and I think it helps because that's really what we all need, is some kind of hope for the future. Okay, I'll close with prayer, and then I'll let Andy say whatever. So, Heavenly Father, thank you for Daniel 2. Thank you for the fact that you're in charge of the world and that you give us hope and that it's not left to what we do, but that you provided a solution for us. And so thank you for that, and thank you for your grace and that you love us enough to try to rescue us. In Jesus' name, amen.